Great. Thanks so much. So welcome everyone to the first Statistical Methods for Health Equity webinar series of this year. So this is a monthly webinar series focusing on statistical and machine learning methods that have the potential to promote health equity. For example, methods that can shed light on the complex factors underlying inequalities, or fairer algorithms that can appropriately take into account the biases that exist in biomedical data sets. And so this series is co-hosted by the Alan Turing Institute, specifically the Health Equity Interest Group, the UCL Statistical Science Department, and the Data Science for Health Equity Group, which is also called DISHI. And DISHI's aim is to ensure that the latest research and innovations in data science, machine learning, and AI improve everyone's health, especially those in underserved populations. We'll pop a couple of links in the chat if you're interested to learn more or want to get involved. And today I would like to welcome Charles Jones from Imperial College London. Charles is a fourth-year PhD student at Imperial College London, and his research is at the intersection of fairness and causality in machine learning for medical imaging. I'm going to hand over to Charles, and you can, do your more introduction if you'd like, but I'll let you take it away from here. And I think Vanessa's popped the links in the chat. Thanks, Vanessa.
Great, thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm Charles Jones. Everyone calls me Charlie, and you're welcome to too. And I'm going to be talking to you today about how we can use causality to understand dataset bias in medical imaging, and what the implications are for what methods we should be using for fairness in medical imaging. Now, I'll be honest for 1 second. As a listener, I don't really like listening to talks which get really bogged down in details like equations and tables of results and things like that. So I'm going to try and take a slightly different approach today. Most of this talk will be about understanding the motivations and background for our work. And I really truly believe this is the best way to understand it. And you can always get more details from the papers I'm going to link to. If I do my job of explaining the background correctly, then by the time I explain to you the takeaways from our most recent paper, I really hope you find them almost obvious in light of the understanding that I hopefully will give you today. So the talk will loosely be structured in 3 parts. I'm going to assume you're all fairly familiar with some statistics, machine learning, and a little bit of fairness. And I'll start by briefly motivating what I think of as a really key problem in machine learning fairness for medical imaging field. We'll then go on a little bit of a journey where we first try to understand what dataset bias actually is, and then we're going to try and link back and apply that knowledge to start to solve the problem. And the talk is mainly about our most recent paper, Rethinking Fair Representation Learning for Performance-Sensitive Tasks. And I'm really happy to say this has just been accepted to ICLR this year. We'll also touch on 2 of my previous papers, which we published in MICAI and Nature Machine Intelligence, and we'll see how the insights from those help to set up this one. Now, finally, it's a Friday, and I know the ICML deadline is just around the corner, so I'm probably going to aim for around half an hour of talking, leave plenty of time for questions and discussions, but also feel free to interrupt me at any point you like with any questions. So let's get started. We're going to start by introducing the problem. We're going to be focusing on disease classification tasks today, and we're going to be pretty agnostic towards the domain and the disease. So this could be anything from identifying pneumonia in a chest X-ray to detecting a malignant tumor from a dermatology image or more. And as I'm sure we all know, that in the right conditions, today's deep learning methods can perform very close to the level of a human radiologist or expert. Now, in machine learning, in medical imaging and machine learning, we've started to see really concerning reports, such as these prominent ones, where it turns out that when our training data is less than perfect, these models can fail. And unfortunately, when they fail, it's often in the ways that you might expect, given what we know about historical and ongoing biases in healthcare. For example, we often see machine learning models pick up on sensitive information relating to age, sex, race, etc., and they use it to bias their predictions. Now, in machine learning for fairness, we generally use the notation A to represent a sensitive attribute that we're talking about. So I'm going to use that throughout the slides. Now, what's the most intuitive way to tackle this problem? The most intuitive way is definitely just to prevent models from using this sensitive information that we care about. And methods based on this approach are called fair representation learning methods. And these will be the focus of this talk. They generally work by enforcing statistical independence between the learned representations of your model and the sensitive attribute. It started with this 2013 paper from Zemel et al., but it's been done and done and done and done and done and done and done over and over again in all these papers and more. I'm not even scratching the surface of how popular this idea is. And over the last years, we've seen lots of popular techniques from machine learning get imported into fair representation learning. For example, the main methods nowadays, they generally try and use either some sort of adversarial loss or some sort of disentanglement term to try and enforce this desired invariance. And I think it's not hard to see why those are the methods we go for. It's pretty much just because these are popular methods from machine learning over the last few years, and it's quite a natural idea to think, let's use it to enforce some sort of fairness constraint. Now, what are the problems with this? I think despite FRL, fair representation learning, being one of the most studied areas in fairness, I think there's a lot of confusion on the existing literature in this topic. For example, these 3 papers here, they all show FRL methods failing on these quite comprehensive benchmarks. And they warn that if we apply FRL in the wrong settings, we can end up harming people instead of helping them. And I think we should just step back for a second and appreciate how weird this is, right? Like all of the papers on that previous slide, they proposed methods and they all demonstrated state-of-the-art results on some benchmarks. If they didn't, they wouldn't have been published papers. But here we can see some really comprehensive results showing the opposite effect. And understanding this contradiction is the goal of the talk today, and you can find more detail about it in our recent iClear paper. Now, I really want you to keep this contradiction in your head as we take a step back, and we'll embark on a journey together over the next few slides, where we're first going to try and understand what we mean when we say a data set is biased, and then we're going to think about what we're actually trying to do when we develop fairness methods. Once we have a clear idea of these issues, I think the results from our paper will fall out quite naturally, and we'll be able to start to resolve these contradictions. So let's get going and understand data set bias. We're going to take a moment to think about what we actually mean when we say a data set is biased, and we're going to use causal diagrams as a language to understand this. I'm going to assume you all have some familiarity with this, but for those of you who may be less confident, you can think of these diagrams as a way to represent independence relationships and distributions. So, for example, if you look at this graph here, as well as that, we additionally imbue these graphs with some extra meaning about what happens when we intervene on or change a variable. So if we intervene on a variable, that will affect the variable's children, but it won't affect the variable's parents. So if we intervene on the variable A in the graph, it will affect XA. But if we intervene on XA, it won't affect A, because A causes XA, and intervening on an effect can't change the cause. So this graph is going to be our setup of the problem. And the way we're going to get to it is we're going to think of X as an input image, and we're going to decompose it into 2 latent components, where XA is the sensitive information that we're talking about that is directly caused by A, and XZ is the task-specific information which is directly caused by the underlying condition Z. The reason we introduce a distinction between the underlying condition Z and the label that we want to predict Y, the reason we distinguish between them is just because we want to be able to model some sort of label noise with our graph. So if you imagine the case where there's no label noise, that is Y is equal to Z, the graph actually collapses to what might be a familiar graph for people who do causality, which would be the anti-causal classification graph. Now, we can define a criterion on this graph, which we're going to call the no bias criterion. And this is where Y is independent of XA given XZ. And what this would imply is that only the task-specific information is relevant to predicting the target, and sensitive information is irrelevant, and a model would gain no information from no benefit from exploiting this information. This is going to be really important as we sort of move forward. Now, in our previous Nature Machine Intelligence paper, we demonstrate how, starting with this setup, you can use the no bias criterion to arrive at 3 fundamental mechanisms of data set bias. For those of you familiar with causality, this is essentially an application of the D-separation criterion. And the graphs look like this. And we call them presentation disparities, prevalence disparities, and annotation disparities. These are the 3 simplest graphs that violate that criterion that we set up earlier. Now, presentation disparities would be a situation where the same underlying condition appears differently in different groups. For example, you could imagine a situation where different hospitals refer patients for scans at different points in their disease progression, and then you'd imagine the same diseases may actually look different in the images because the disease has progressed differently for these different groups. A prevalence disparity would be where the same underlying condition has different prevalence across groups. This is quite straightforward to think about. You can imagine situations where different groups have different access to healthcare, for example. And finally, an annotation disparity would be where the same underlying condition is diagnosed or annotated with different policies across groups. Again, you can imagine a situation where maybe different hospitals have different diagnosis policies, or maybe different annotators are annotating images, and they might have different levels of experience, for example, and that might correlate for some reason with a sensitive attribute. Now, the real insight from this previous paper is that different biases may be indistinguishable from observational data, but they might require different mitigation strategies. Complicating this even further is the fact that each of these disparities I mentioned may be caused by an ethically acceptable mechanism or an ethically unacceptable mechanism. And what this means is that you really need to think about, are you trying to use that information from that, just from that pathway, or are you trying to not use it? So I'm going to assume in this work that these disparities are unfair, and we wish to leverage information from the fair causal pathways, which are the black ones, and ignore information from the unfair causal pathways, which are the red ones. Finally, I'm just going to mention that these are the most simple graphs representing dataset bias. You can derive more complicated ones from the no bias criterion as well, and the same results will apply. Now, there's one more aspect of dataset bias that I think is worth introducing at this point, and that's subgroup separability, which we introduced in our previous MICAD paper. We can think of this as studying the strength of that causal pathway between XA and A, i.e. how much sensitive information is actually encoded in the image in the first place. And in our MICAD paper, we did some theoretical and experimental analysis, and we found, firstly, that subgroup separability varies a lot in medical imaging. For example, it's almost trivial to classify sex from chest X-ray, but it's very difficult to classify sex from something like an eye image. Secondly, disease classified trained with empirical risk minimization, the conventional methods, they implicitly end up relying on that sensitive information when there's some sort of data set bias. This is essentially a validation of what we were talking about with that no bias criterion earlier. And the final insight was that if we inject the same data set bias into different data sets, and those data sets have varying degrees of subgroup separability, what we'll find is that the models trained on the higher separability data sets become more biased and have more performance degradation than the low separability data sets. And the reason we can think about this is, the way we can think about this is that while there may be some underlying dataset bias, subgroup separability is the thing that enables models to pick up on that bias and actually leverage it for their predictions. The nice thing about it is it's also quite easy to measure, which makes it quite a useful tool to see if a dataset has the potential for being biased or the potential to induce a model to be biased. So now we've got some understanding of subgroup separability and causal structures of dataset bias. We're ready to move on to part 3 of this talk, which is where we're actually going to talk about fair representation learning. Now, I'm not going to hide it from you any longer. I think the reason why the previous FRL evaluations in the literature are so confusing and so conflicting is the same as the reason why many fairness problems are difficult. And the key is our assumptions and our definitions. Different studies make different implicit assumptions about what is considered fair, but for some reason, they seem to reuse the same methods to combat their biases, which doesn't really make too much sense. And I think it's this misapplication of fairness methods in settings they weren't designed for that is the source of this confusion. So we've identified 3 paradigms of group fairness research that we're going to discuss for a second. The first is the paradigm that aims to enforce group parity. The second is the paradigm that aims to maximize subgroup-wise performance. And the third is the paradigm that aims to generalize to unbiased distributions. Now, we found this approach of organizing the literature really powerful, because once you understand these paradigms and their goals, you can look at fairness papers and very quickly understand what they're actually trying to do. And I think this is the real key to overcoming a lot of the confusion and complexity that exists in the literature. So the first group fairness paradigm is for methods that focus on enforcing group parity. This is most of the early work in fair machine learning. This work focuses on measuring properties of our classifiers across groups, such as true positive rates for each group, PPV for each group, calibration for each group, etc. And once you do that, it's quite straightforward to mitigate this definition of bias. You could use some sort of regularizer or even some sort of post-processing, for example. And here's a figure that I really like that explains how all of these metrics can be seen as taking a different slice of a series of stacked confusion matrices, one for each subgroup. And what you can kind of see is that a lot of the older research in fairness would essentially pick one of these metrics and say, okay, this time, this is the one thing we need to make equal for all groups. This will make it fair. And then they'll come up with some system for doing that, and that'll be the paper. Now, I think this paradigm has a couple of major issues. Firstly, it's really well known that all of these metrics are incompatible with each other in all but the most trivial cases. For example, you can't have demographic parity, equal opportunity, and equal calibration at the same time, apart from a trivial model. The other issue, and I think the one that's more important for today, is this paradigm is not aligned with performance. In practice, enforcing any of these metrics leads to worsening performance for one or even all groups. A simple way to convince yourself of this is to remember that a completely randomized classifier actually achieves all of these notions of fairness. Now, when we try and apply some sort of regularizer or post-processing to a model, it's not likely that that's going to increase performance. It's more likely that it's simply going to change the model to make it more like the random classifier. Now, I'm not an ethicist, so what I'm about to say next is just my opinion, but I'm just going to go out and say that I don't think this is a very sensible solution for medical imaging. What enforcing group parity would mean here is it would mean that you deliberately misdiagnose some patients who you could have correctly diagnosed. And I find this really hard to justify. So I'm actually going to claim that this paradigm is generally not useful when your task is performance sensitive. So now we've seen the first paradigm of fairness analysis. What's the second paradigm? This is where we focus on maximizing subgroup-wise performance. It's often called min-max fairness, and it really arose as a response to these issues with the group parity paradigm. And I think nowadays it seems very common in the medical imaging field, at least. Here, all we do is we simply measure a performance metric, such as accuracy or AUC, and we measure it for each group. And we say that the fairest model is the one that achieves the best possible performance for each and all groups. We can even enforce it with some fairly simple methods. You can see in the figure here that there may be some sort of Pareto front between performance for one group and performance for another. Our previous paradigm of fairness, the group parity one, would get us to a model like C, which is Pareto inefficient. This means that you could actually improve performance for both groups, or at least one group, without harming the other one. The goal of this paradigm is to get us somewhere on that Pareto frontier, like models A or B, and then you can choose where on the front you'd rather be, depending on your ethical preferences. So this is a really appealing paradigm of fairness analysis, and it's actually very easy to measure, just like the last one. But unfortunately, I think it also has quite a big flaw, and that's that almost every benchmark that you could use is IID due to the practice of randomly splitting your train and test sets. And thus, any bias present in your training data set must also be present in your test set. So if we maximize performance on some biased test set, we're likely to end up with a model that just reflects that bias. And this is why I say that this paradigm essentially ignores the underlying problem of data set bias. It treats fairness as a modeling problem as opposed to a data problem. And this may be more justifiable than the last paradigm, but I think we can see that there are probably still some issues when we use it for medical imaging. So I guess we're going to move on now to the third paradigm of fairness analysis. And this focuses on generalizing to an unbiased distribution. This is a bit like the last paradigm. However, instead of maximizing subgroup-wise performance on the biased IID test set, we wish to maximize performance on some unbiased setting. As you might expect, this ends up being very closely related to work in domain generalization. And the figure here shows a color amnist benchmark where you can see there's a spurious correlation between digit and color. And the optimal decision boundary for the bias training set is this diagonal one, which reflects the spurious correlation between digit and color, whereas we want to learn the vertical decision boundary that ignores the spurious correlation and would be optimal for the unbiased data set. Now, I'll be honest for a second, this is my preferred paradigm of fairness analysis. I think it makes the most theoretical sense. And interestingly, there's actually an equivalent way to state this paradigm, which relates back to our previous nature machine intelligence paper. So if we imagine the potential for there to be fair and unfair causal pathways, we can imagine that we might want to use information from fair causal pathways and ignore information from unfair causal pathways. And if we imagine fair causal pathways as being stable across domains and unfair ones as being spurious and shifting across domains, then that becomes equivalent to saying you want to maximize performance on an unbiased distribution that's out of distribution. So it becomes equivalent to this paradigm. Now, I won't pretend there's no problems with this paradigm. There is still quite a big problem, but it's more practical than theoretical. The issue is that we don't have any real-world examples of biased data sets that have an equivalent unbiased version. You know, if we had the unbiased data, we'd probably just use that instead of the biased version, right? So when we want to evaluate fairness methods that are trying to do this sort of thing, we only really have a couple of options, which is that we can either use some sort of toy data set where we have very good control over the bias, or we can take a real world data set and maybe inject some bias into the trained set and leave the test set clean. This is probably a slightly better approach, but you can see that it probably isn't perfect still. There's another kind of issue, which is just that the methods in this field, just like the methods in domain generalization, they're still fairly young and they don't really work 100% of the time. There's still a lot we don't understand about how to build methods that really work for this. But I think that makes it quite exciting, to be honest. So now we have some understanding of these different fairness paradigms. We can now get our answer for why there are contradictions in FRL in the fairness literature. Different studies are implicitly using these different paradigms. Now, fair representation learning was initially proposed for the group parity paradigm, which raises a pretty interesting question. What can we actually expect when we apply it or misapply it into these other two settings? And this is the final part of this presentation. And I think we're finally ready to talk about some of the theoretical and experimental results from our most recent ICLIR paper. So first, let's consider the IID performance maximization paradigm. Here, the takeaway is extremely straightforward. I think FRL is futile and you should not be using it. We provide a proof in the paper, but we could explain it in words pretty simply. One, FRL requires that all sensitive information is removed from the model's representations. Two, if that information was useful for the prediction task, this must worsen performance. And three, if that information was irrelevant, then FRL would provide no benefit over a conventional ERM method, which wouldn't be using it anyway. This essentially follows from that causal setup with the no bias criterion that we mentioned earlier. And while there have been previous proofs about the limitations of FRL in the literature, I think this is probably the simplest, and it may also be the most general, seeing as it really clearly invalidates this method for this whole paradigm of fairness analysis. It applies to really any data sets following the causal structures we set up earlier, and indeed a broader class that also have the same sort of relationships too. Now, we back this theory up by training empirically. We trained some fair representation learning models and some conventional empirical risk minimization models. And we trained them on 5 different medical data sets, which each have multiple sensitive attributes. And this gives us 11 data set attribute combinations. And we look at the subgroup-wise performance of FRL against ERM. And you can see in the plots that FRL is pretty much always either doing nothing or it's worsening performance, which sort of backs up this theory. An interesting pattern actually happens too, which is that when we organize our data sets by subgroup separability, like in the figure, we get this pattern that performance degrades more on data sets with low separability and it integrates less on datasets with high separability. And I think what this indicates is that, at least in these datasets, when there's more sensitive information, it's actually easier to remove it without affecting the primary task. However, when there's less sensitive information, it seems to end up being more entangled with the prediction task. And when you remove it, you end up harming the task a bit more. Now, I think this is pretty cut and dry, the takeaway for the IID performance maximization paradigm. The distribution shift paradigm is a bit more complicated. Now, it's pretty difficult to get theoretical results for this paradigm without making some quite strong assumptions that would narrow the scope of the proof. If you're interested in causality, I think the way that you would do it is to think about causal identifiability of the XZ feature that we talked about earlier. But even if FRL is not theoretically perfect, even if we can't prove identifiability, there's something to be said that it may still have some practical benefit. We know that under distribution shifts with dataset bias, ERM models are going to pick up on the bias and they're going to end up performing pretty badly. So FRL, even if it's not perfect, it may still be useful if it doesn't fail quite as badly as ERM. So instead of going down the theoretical route for this paradigm, we instead propose two hypotheses and we support them with some empirical evidence. The first is that we wonder if, well, we suspect that FRL validity under distribution shift will depend on the structure of the bias, which would be those structures that we talked about earlier. And the second would be that FRL validity under distribution shift depends on subgroup separability. And we find some initial evidence to show that these might be true. So we repeat our previous experiments and we look at each structure of bias and we also look at subgroup separability. All of these experiments involve injecting some sort of artificial bias according to these mechanisms into the train set and testing on some clean data. And what we can see is that in high subgroup separability data sets, FRL may be useful, and it seems particularly useful in the presentation disparities case, where it can actually improve performance for group one. Group one in this setting is the one which is sort of getting punished by the dataset bias. So ideally, we'd probably improve performance for group one and keep performance for group zero roughly constant, which is what's happening in the presentation disparities case at that top end. Now, we also see that in the low separability settings, FRL seems to be really unhelpful and it seems to make performance quite a bit worse. The way that I'm thinking about this is if we think about, if you think about an ERM method, what we know from the subgroup separability paper is that on low separability data sets, ERM methods don't actually become that biased. They don't use that much of the bias, they don't pick up on the information that much. So the ERM methods are doing pretty well. And when we use the FRL methods, which remove the information, but also remove some task-specific information, it ends up not being a worthwhile trade-off. Whereas in the higher separability end of the spectrum, we know that ERM models can get a lot more biased. And so even if FRL methods do remove some task-specific information, it ends up being worth it a bit more because for generalization purposes, because they end up removing the bias a bit better. So I think this gives us a good idea that both hypotheses and both of the aspects of dataset bias that we covered earlier may be part of the puzzle. But I'd like to say that I consider these results still a bit tentative at this point, and I really strongly welcome further theoretical and empirical work that might better understand the validity of these methods under distribution shift. I think there's a lot of potential for this to be connected with work in domain generalization in the future as well. And so I'm really excited to see, where people might go with this. So these are the main two takeaways from our paper. And I think I want to keep it sort of really clear and concise and just give you these two things to think about. Now, the final thing I'm going to leave you with is a bit more of a meta point about fairness research, which is that I'm not convinced it's particularly compatible with our typical machine learning approach, where we might want to specify some metrics, aim for state-of-the-art results by training a lot of models and finding some benchmarks, and then reporting those results and saying, we're best in class. I think instead, what I've tried to show here is that we really need to think about our assumptions. What bias do we think our underlying data has? Which fairness paradigm is actually appropriate for our setting? And what would mitigating bias even look like for what we're trying to do? I'm not an ethicist, so I can't answer any of these questions really. I think what I've been trying to do throughout this talk is to demonstrate how this field can be a bit of a confusing mess sometimes, and how we shouldn't shy away from these underlying questions because we can only clear up this confusion by actually starting to tackle them. Now, I've also mentioned that I prefer the distribution shift paradigm of fairness, but in this paradigm, even evaluation is pretty difficult. Remember that in our experiments, we had to inject some artificial bias into the training set and treat the clean data sets as unbiased. I think this is the best thing we can do, but it's still quite crude, and I think it's unlikely to perfectly simulate, what a complex real-world bias would look like. I think the only way forward for the field is to collect better data sets where we have better knowledge of the underlying data generating processes, where we can make really good assumptions about what biases we have. And ideally, we can bring on board domain experts who can, tell us what they think might be ethical or unethical in different situations. And I think that's the note I really want to leave you on. So I really want to thank you for listening. I may have spoken a bit fast, so I think we'll have plenty of time. But yeah, really welcome to do any discussion that you'd like at this point.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could actually pop the links to any of the papers that you mentioned, like the ones that you particularly refer to. That would be really helpful.
Yep.
Yeah, and useful to refer back to. But I'll open it up. If anybody has any questions, feel free to write in the chat, or you can unmute, raise your hand, whatever you like. I will ask just a very general question whilst people are, gathering their thoughts. And for you, what does better data sets in the medical imaging look like? You said that was kind of like the way forward. As an outsider to the imaging world, what does that mean?
So I guess I can give you an example more by picking on some of our current ones. Some of our current ones like Checkspert and Mimic CXR, the way they're collected, they're very big data sets, which is really great for research. But the way they're annotated is actually by using an NLP model on radiology reports. So we really have no idea what's going on with the labels. Some people have, tried to get gold standard labels for subsets of it, and they found, just wild results where, the actual accuracy of the labels is pretty low. So it's, I think we need to move. Ideally, we can get some better large data sets that are firstly just more reliable. And then moving on from that, it'd be really nice if we can get a better understanding of what the underlying data generating process is. So if every single thing that people have done to touch that data is firstly documented, and hopefully also we can get some doctors in to talk about what might the biological mechanisms be too, then I think that would be the perfect sort of situation to do proper causal analysis.
No, it's good to have a vision, a dream for the future. But yeah, thank you. Brio, do you want to come in? Oh, Brio, I can't hear you. I don't know if other people can.
I'm afraid I can't either.
Yeah, it says that you're on mute, but I just can't hear you. No. I can come to somebody who's written a question in the chat, and then we can come back to you, Brio, maybe. But you're welcome to unmute yourself, Analia. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, otherwise I can read it out for you. She just wanted to clarify, just to make sure I got this right around. Did you say that high separability in the data leads to greater bias being picked up?
So what we found is that for a conventional empirical risk minimization model, when that's trained on data sets with higher separability, that picks up on the bias more. So there's more sensitive information, which gives it more capacity to actually use that bias. One way you can think about it, if we go all the way back to the slide where we introduced it, is in this equation here. This is just a decomposition of the mapping from image to label, and you can use the law of total probability to get this quite simply. And what it really tells us is that what a perfect model would do is it would learn different subgroup-wise mappings and then weight them by the subgroups of probability for each group. So it's this PA given X term that really matters in this equation. How good is the model at actually classifying A from the sensitive attribute from X? And when it's really good at that, it will essentially just use the biased subgroup-wise mapping for the bad group and leave the other groups untouched. And so this is why we say it picks up on the bias more when there's high separability.
Great, thanks. Feel free to come back in if anything else wasn't clear, or if it's easier to write in the chat. Brio, do you want to try again? I can hear you, but it's very quiet.
Hold on. Is that
It
better?
sounds better. It sounds better. Yeah.
Okay, good. Awesome. Thanks for a great talk, Charlie. I really, really like this work. I've got like a few questions, and actually just on some of the things that you just mentioned in terms of the like the more information on like the data generating process. There's actually some recommendations, some guidelines that came out like last week called the Standing Together recommendations on kind of recommendations for how you report data sets that are being used to train medical algorithms. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. Then one of the questions I had was around the like fundamental mechanisms from your Nature Machine Intelligence paper, and I was just kind of curious as to in what sense are they like fundamental?
Yeah, I guess the way that the reason we say they're sort of fundamental is because if you take this initial setup and you apply the deseparation criterion to see which pathways would violate these independence relationships, the sort of, I guess, three simplest and most natural graphs that you'd get from that would be these ones from here. I guess I'm being slightly loose by saying they're fundamental. I think, maybe you might, like, I'm not sort of saying I've proved that they're the most fundamental ones, but I think they're good starting points. And it's more of a, I don't think they're the only possible bias mechanisms. I just think they're ones that we should first think about, and then we can also think about more complex ones later.
Yeah, okay. That makes total sense. I mean, they seem like very natural like mechanisms, which I can see how they would arise in practice. I was just wondering if they were like, are they like building blocks to other types of mechanisms of bias? But got it. The other thing I was wondering around was, so I'm not super familiar with like the kind of fairness medical imaging literature, but there's also, fairness kind of with like tabular data sets. And I was kind of curious, like what's the kind of main difference between, fairness in medical imaging versus other like notions of fairness?
That's a great point. And I first want to say I'm definitely not the biggest expert on the tabular setting, but what I would say I think is the most important difference purely comes from the dimensionality of images. So we use these sort of XA and XZ notions here. The important thing to remember is these are essentially latent features. We don't get direct access to them, and we're hoping our model will implicitly pick up on them. And this is what makes it kind of difficult, because if we did have direct access to XZ and we could make good assumptions about our data, it wouldn't be too difficult to design a transportable model by essentially just using the information from XZ. And we could use our classic causality methods, like do calculus and things to make sure that we're not accidentally using bad information. The thing that makes it slightly trickier is that XZ is hopefully extracted in the representations of our model. And this is why I said that making proofs about the distribution shift setting is quite hard. The reason is because you'd probably have to first prove that you can actually build a model that could identifiably separate between XZ and XA, which at that point you could then use sort of tabular methods on top of that, I think. But yeah, I think that's the sort of main difference that I see. Please let me know if you see any others though.
No, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about the kind of the latentness of the Z variable. I suppose I think I can kind of imagine other settings where not imaging data where you might have like a similar kind of challenge. I think in genetics, you'd have like a very similar thing where you've got like all these kind of genetic variants that are working together in like a in like a low dimensional way relative to the raw data. But then you've got this kind of protected characteristic in terms of like race or ethnicity, which is like correlated with the genetics, but not like exactly the same by any means. Yeah, no, super interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any additional questions? But otherwise, I'll say thank you very much, Charlie, for joining us today. It was really interesting. Yeah, we will. Oh, thanks, Bria, for putting this down together. So there. Yes, we will send around a recording of this, and it will also be on the Dishy YouTube channel should you want to check it again. But yeah, I hope everyone has a nice weekend or the rest of their Friday. But yeah, it was really great. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Very nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.